begin with our big story and the growing legal battle over that controversial new law in Texas. The U.S. Department of Justice is now taking the state of Texas to court over SB 4, a measure that makes crossing the border illegally a state crime. It empowers state and local law enforcement to arrest people they suspect of entering the country illegally and would allow state judges to remove migrants from Texas and send them back over the border. This was Texas Governor Greg Abbott's reaction to that lawsuit, writing, "I like my chances," and saying his state is the only one trying to stop undocumented immigration. But the main point the Justice Department is making here is that it's not Texas's job. Under long-standing U.S. law, enforcing immigration is something the federal government does. Here's what DOJ lawyers wrote in that lawsuit. Quote, "Texas cannot run its own immigration system. Its efforts through SB 4 intrude on the federal government's exclusive authority to regulate the entry and removal of non-citizens, frustrate the U.S.'s immigration operations and proceedings, and interfere with U.S. foreign relations." So to break all of this down, including that legal filing, we turn to Matt Rivers, our Mexico City-based correspondent who covers immigration for us. Matt, my first question to you is, obviously, the U.S. government here saying it's not your job, Texas, to regulate immigration. That's the federal government's job. What is Texas's response to all of that?
Simply put, Jay, they're just saying, no, we don't agree. We don't think that it is only the federal government's job, if only because it is the state's job to protect its own state citizens, and that's what Texas is saying it's doing here. What the federal government is pointing to is that long-standing precedent that you mentioned, including a recent Supreme Court case a little over a decade ago, back in 2012. Our viewers might remember this Arizona law, a similarly tough immigration law called SB 1070, made it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court largely struck down that entire bill, basically saying it is the federal government's job to carry out immigration policy. Texas knows all of this, Jay. They know all of this, and yet they say that if the federal government is abstaining in its role as immigration arbiter, it must step in order to protect its citizens, because what it's saying is that its citizens are at risk because of the high number of migrant crossings here. And one thing I'll add, the Texas Republicans that passed this law, they knew they were going to get challenged in court. So in their minds, it's a win-win. They're fighting the good fight, and if they lose, well, they can tell their constituents, hey, we're still trying to do something about all this immigration. If they win, well, hey, they're carrying out the immigration policies they want to carry out. So this is something Texas Republicans have been planning for since they passed this bill.
This is my highlighted copy of that complaint. The Department of Justice filed the word Arizona, that Arizona case. They cite it all over this thing, so you're exactly right. I want to pivot, though. We're learning today that the city of New York is suing the bus companies that Texas Governor Greg Abbott has been using to send migrants to New York and other Democrat-led northern cities. Abbott is just now responding. What more are we learning about that?
Yeah, what Greg Abbott is saying is that he thinks that this lawsuit is frivolous and that it actually might be against the law in terms of what Mayor Adams is trying to do here, because what Abbott is saying is that it was the United States government who permitted these people, these migrants, to come into the United States, and because of free travel between the states, Abbott is saying that these migrants have a right to go to New York City. Also, what Abbott is saying is that each one of the migrants that have been going on these buses, they have signed a piece of paper, they know where they're going, and they're making the choice to do so. They're not doing so against their will. What I will tell you is that that's not entirely true, and I know that because I've spoken to migrants who went to get on those buses, and maybe they signed a piece of paper. Was it clear that they had an option to not sign the piece of paper? No, that wasn't clear to them. They had no idea what was awaiting them in New York City or in Chicago or one of these other cities that they were going. So it's not so black and white. When Abbott says every migrant is fully informed of the decision that he or she is making, I can tell you that's not entirely the case, but that does not stop Greg Abbott from going against what Eric Adams is doing here, saying that they're already in the United States, and because of that, they're allowed to travel freely within the U.S. as long as no one's forcing them to do so.
Matt, one more thing for us. We saw that contingent of more than 60 House Republicans go down to the border yesterday. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson was there. He said America was at a quote-unquote breaking point with the current number of undocumented immigrants coming into the United States, clearly signaling that this is going to be a key political issue for Republicans in 2024. Give us a reality check of what you have seen in your coverage of the border and what officials there are telling you the situation is and what they need.
Yeah, I've been covering the border for years now, and I keep coming back around this time every single year, so I've got years past to compare it to. It is a crisis. There's no other way really to describe it. And I say that from the point of view of the migrants, of law enforcement, of local municipalities, of state governments. It is bad for everyone involved in what is happening at the border, and it is simply unsustainable. When you talk about what is needed at the border, it's basically more of everything. It's more people to process asylum claims. It's more people to help the migrants get the kind of food, water, housing that they actually need. It's more law enforcement capability because Border Patrol and CBP stretched entirely too thin. And when you're talking about long-term solutions here, there's really two things that need to happen. One, more resources needed at the border to deal with this influx of people. But two, I feel like a broken record, but it is comprehensive immigration reform because we have an immigration system that is designed for the immigration realities of the mid-'80s. And yet we haven't upgraded it or updated it in decades. And so our immigration system entirely outdated, unprepared to match this moment. This is the new reality of so many people coming to the border, and the United States immigration law simply is not prepared to meet those challenges.
Matt Rivers, thank you as always for us, sir. I really appreciate your time. Thank you again. I want to take this now to our big story panel. Joining us today, our ABC News contributors, Sirius XM radio host Mike Muse, former Trump administration official Sarah Isgur, former Democratic U.S. Senator from North Dakota Heidi Heitkamp, and op-ed columnist for the Los Angeles Times, LZ Granderson. Thank you all. Welcome in. Heidi, I want to start with you because you heard Matt say comprehensive immigration reform. We know the Senate is right now locked in negotiations over that exact issue. Yesterday in that trip to the border, though, we were just talking about the Speaker of the House and what he said down there, and he also drew a kind of line in the sand. He said Republicans would not consider any kind of immigration reform that comes out of the Senate if it doesn't include elements of a hardline border bill that they passed last year. All of that is the wind-up to say, how do you think that's going to go over with your former colleagues there in the Senate, where you need bipartisan agreement to get anything done?
Well, this whole issue screams out for people working together. How can you say this is a crisis and we aren't pulling together? And I mentioned that on both sides, and I really applaud the Senate. But I want everyone to remember that back in some of the first couple of years that I was in the Senate, we passed overwhelmingly immigration reform, almost 70 votes. And Paul Ryan, who was then the Speaker, refused to take it up because it's always been a political football, much the same way it is today in the House of Representatives. But, you know, the one thing I do want to say is I find it interesting the northern mayors saying we can't possibly handle all of these migrants when they expect Texas to handle all the migrants. This is something we all need to work together to solve this problem. We need to work with our neighbors to the south.
LZ, you heard Heidi mention there the false starts we've had before in immigration reform. What would it say this time around if the United States again falls short on a compromise here?
Well, unfortunately, I'm expecting us to fall short on the compromise because, you know, Heidi's 100% correct. Unfortunately, we have too many elected officials who benefit from there not being a resolution to this. And that has been a driver on both sides for way too long. You know, my real concern about all of this is just how awful it looks as far as how the Biden administration has been handling this as it pertains to Democrats. You expect Mike Johnson, Republicans, to use this opportunity to drive home their message. But the fact that you have so many Democratic mayors and governors also jumping in and saying that they need help, that is a self-inflicted wound for the Biden administration.
Sarah, I want to turn back very quickly to SB 4, that new law in Texas. How do you see Texas's argument going over with a federal judge and ultimately the Supreme Court? Is this a play to just get this in front of the Supreme Court, as Matt indicated some Texas Republicans have said it is?
Well, we had a version of this case last term in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, look, Congress has to give the executive branch money if you actually want them to do immigration enforcement at the border. They haven't done that. And to Heidi's point, this is, by the way, not just, when Democrats control the Senate and Republicans control the House. Barack Obama had a unified government. He had the White House, the House, and the Senate and didn't do it. And so did Donald Trump. So, you have these states just gasping for help because you can't have a social safety net where you're guaranteed hospital access, you're guaranteed an education, and then not have a border. No other country has this problem.
Mike, we're in an election year. How do you see this current crisis at the border impacting voters?
I think it's going to be a top of mind for voters going into, in particular, this presidential election cycle, and particularly if these candidates cannot broaden the conversation out, that this just doesn't fall squarely with the Oval Office, but actual funding needs to occur from Congress in order to assist, to what Heidi said, some of these northern cities. To me, this is political gamesmanship at its finest when you have Governor Abbott strategically targeting Democratic states and blue states. If we want to make this a truly comprehensive immigration reform, it does include other mayors and governors of red states too as well, because we're all one nation that needs to solve, as Matt Rivers said, this antiquated comprehensive immigration reform.
Mike, Sarah, Heidi, LZ, thank you for your time. Stay with us.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.